Why, hey everybody, welcome along. This is part 10 now of the Attenborough readings that we're doing as part of your tutor reading. So if you're still going with me, good on you. We're starting a new chapter, as you can clearly see on the screen today, and that one is Sloths and Snakes. I mean, that bodes well as a chapter title, doesn't it? So a reminder that David Attenborough and his cameraman, Charles Legos, are in the jungle and off and about trying to discover different animals as part of their TV series they're making in the 1950s. So here we go. We could have spent much time wandering in the forests and yet seeing little, so we decided to augment our limited knowledge and experience by recruiting two of the Akaweos who worked on the station to accompany us on our jaunts. So that's a reminder, that's like the local people who are with them. Their eyes were more skilled than ours in spotting the smaller animals, and they also knew the forest so intimately that they could take us to the flowering trees that might be attracting hummingbirds, and to others in fruit that might be visited by flocks of parrots or troops of monkeys. Our first major success, however, was scored by Jack. We were walking through the forest not far from the airstrip, picking our way through spiny creepers. We paused at the base of one of the largest trees we had so far found. From its branches high above us hung thick lianas in immobile contortions. These are almost like the names of the creepers and the vines that dangle down. If we could have concentrated several years of the lianas' movements into a few minutes, we should have seen them twisting and writhing, strangling both themselves and the trees from which they hung. Jack looked up into the tangle. "Is there anything up there, or is it my imagination?" he said softly. I could see nothing. Jack explained more carefully where I should look, and at last I saw what he had spotted, a round grey shape hanging upside down from a liana. It was a sloth. Sloths are incapable of rapid movement, and, for a change, there was no risk that this animal would career off and be lost in a few seconds in the higher reaches of the forest roof. There was enough time for us to decide that Charles should film the capture. And of course, remember, they are taking these animals as well and taking them back to London Zoo. So let's just have a quick look at the photo quickly, as it says there. Charles Legos filming in the forest. You might be able to make him out there holding his camera. Here we go then. That Jack's ribs were still painful from a recent fall to prevent him doing anything strenuous, and that I, therefore, should be the one to climb up and bring the mysterious creature down. The ascent was not difficult, for the dangling creepers provided an abundance of holds. The sloth saw me coming, and in a slow-motion frenzy began climbing hand over hand up its liana. It moved so slowly that I was able to overhaul it with ease, and 40 feet above the ground I caught up with it. Now 40 feet, that's over 10 metres. That's several stories high he is climbing up David Attenborough there, without ropes or any safety equipment. The sloth, about the size of a large sheepdog, hung upside down and stared at me with an expression of ineffable sadness on its furry face. Slowly it opened its mouth, exposing its black enamel-less teeth, and did its best to frighten me by making the loudest noise of which it is capable, a faint bronchial wheeze, a bit like a type noise. I stretched out my hand, and in reply the creature made a slow, ponderous swing at me with its foreleg. I drew back, and it blinked mildly, as if surprised that it had failed to hook me. Its two attempts at active defence having been unsuccessful, it now concentrated on clinging firmly to the liana. Loosening its grip was not easy, for my own position was somewhat precarious. Remember, he's high up in a tree here. Holding on to my own liana with one hand, I reached over with the other and tried to detach the sloth. As I prized loose the scimitar-sharp claws on one foot and began to work on the next, the sloth very sensibly, and with maddening deliberation, replaced its loosened foot. At no time did I manage to get more than one limb free at a time. I continued for 5 minutes in this way, not substantially helped by the ribald suggestions that Jack and Charles shouted up at me. Plainly, this one-handed struggle could go on forever. Then I had an idea. Close by me hung a thick, crinkled liana, nicknamed by the Akaweos Granny's Backbone. I called down to Jack to ask him to cut it loose near the ground, and then I pulled the severed end up to me and dangled it near the sloth, as I unfastened each of its legs. The animal was so determined to grasp anything within reach that, limb by limb, I was able to transfer it onto the smaller liana. That done, I gently lowered the liana so that the sloth, clinging obligingly to the end, slowly descended straight into Jack's arms. I clambered down. "Nice, isn't it?" I said. "And it's a different species from the one I remember seeing at the zoo." Yes, it is, replied Jack mournfully. The one in the zoo is a two-toed sloth and has been there for several years, feeding quite happily on apples, lettuce and carrots. This one here is the three-toed species. You've never seen it in London for the simple reason that it will only eat the cecropia plant, and while there's plenty of cecropia here in the forest, there's nothing to be got in London. We knew, therefore, that we had to release it, but before doing so, we decided to keep it for a few days so that we could watch it and film it. We carried it back and put it on the ground near the base of an isolated mango tree near the house. Without a branch to hang from, the sloth had the greatest difficulty in moving at all. Its long legs splayed out, and it was only by laboriously, which means like through hard work, laboriously humping its body that it managed to drag itself across the few yards that separated it from the bole of the mango tree. Once the creature was there, however, it clambered gracefully up the trunk and contentedly suspended itself beneath one of the boughs. Every feature of its body seemed to have been modified in some way to suit its inverted existence, by which it means hanging upside down. Its grey, shaggy hair, instead of flowing down from its backbone towards its stomach, as in any normal creature, was parted along its belly and flowed towards its spine. Its feet were so extensively adapted to act as hangers that they lost all sign of a palm, and hook-like claws appeared to project straight from a furry stump. A wide circle of vision is obviously very necessary when hanging in the treetops, and the animal had a long neck which enabled it to twist its head through almost a full circle. The sloth's neck bones are of considerable interest to the biologist, for whereas nearly all mammals, from mice to giraffes, have only 7 bones in their neck, the three-toed sloth has 9. It is tempting to conclude that this is also a special adaptation for an upside-down life. Unfortunately for the theorists, however, the two-toed sloth, which lives in exactly the same manner and which can perform similar feats of neck mobility, has only 6 neck bones, 1 fewer than nearly all other animals. On the 3rd day, we noticed our sloth craning forward in an endeavour to lick something on its hip. Curious, we looked closer, and to our astonishment, we saw that it was caressing a tiny baby, still wet, that must have been born only a few minutes earlier. The fur of a sloth is supposed to support a growth of microscopic plants, giving the creature a greenish-brown tinge, which is of considerable value to it as camouflage. The birth of this baby, however, did not corroborate this, for the infant could not yet have accumulated its own garden in its own coat, and yet it was exactly the same colour as its mother. Indeed, when it had dried, we had the greatest difficulty in distinguishing it as it nestled in its mother's shaggy fur, occasionally groping along the length of her enormous body to suck from her nipples in her armpits. Oh, what a lovely photo, this one. Ready? There's a great picture of the three-toed sloth and its baby. Now, I'm going to have a quick look. No, I'm really struggling to see the baby. I know it's a black and white photo. I think it might be that. But it's really, really hard to tell. Those are its arms hanging upwards or hanging from the tree. We watched the pair for 2 days, the mother tenderly licking her baby, sometimes detaching one of her legs from the bough above her to support her tiny offspring. The birth seemed to have robbed her of her appetite, and she no longer took slow bites from the cecropia which we tied to her tree. Rather than run the risk of her going hungry, we carried the 2 back to the forest. There we hooked her on to a liana, and with her baby peering at us over her shoulder, she started to climb upwards. When we returned to the spot an hour later to make sure that all was well, mother and child were nowhere to be seen. Soon after we released the sloth, Bill and Daphne Segar had to leave us, their canoe piled high with stores. There still remained a large dump of supplies on the airstrip at Imbamadai, and Kenneth was to return the next day in the canoe to bring down another load. Jack had decided that he should remain at our base for another few days to concentrate on collecting animals in the immediate neighbourhood. But part of our filming schedule was to record something of the everyday life in a Amerindian village, and Bill suggested that, as engine fuel was at a premium, Charles and I should travel upriver with Kenneth, land at one of the villages, and stay there for a time. I should go to Wailemepu first, Bill said. It's a short way up the Kaku River, a tributary of the Mazaruni. One of the villagers is a bright young lad named Clarence who once worked for me here, and who consequently speaks quite good English. Clarence, I asked. That seems rather an odd name for an Akawao. Well, the Indians used to believe in Hallelujah, an odd version of Christianity which arose in the southern part of Guyana in the early 19th century. But Seventh-day Adventist missionaries converted the inhabitants of the Wailamepu village and in the process rechristened them with European names. You get this a lot in some cultures. You would get what they're called missionaries, so Europeans who are Christians or other faiths and travelling over to places to convert the local people to Christianity or types of Christianity, and that's what he's just described in that last paragraph, which is basically they rechristened and gave the locals new names, which is why they've got names like Clarence, which you wouldn't necessarily expect. Of course, he went on, the old names are still used among themselves, but I don't think you will find many Indians who will tell you their Akawao name. He laughed. They seem to be able to combine their old beliefs quite conveniently with the new ones taught by the missionaries and will shift from one to the other whenever it suits them. The Adventists teach, for example, that you should not eat rabbit. Of course, there are no rabbits here, but a large rodent called a labber is roughly equivalent. Unfortunately, labber meat has always been one of the favourite foods of the Indians, and forbidding it was quite a blow to them. There is a story that a missionary once came across one of his Indian converts cooking a labber over a fire. He told the Indian how sinful it was. "But this is not labber," the Indian said, "this is fish." "No fish has two big front teeth like that," replied the missionary crossly. "You speak nonsense." "No, sir," said the Indian. "You know how when you first came to this village you said my Indian name, bad name, and you sprinkled water over me, and say my name now John? Well, sir, I walk in the forest today, I see labber, I shoot him, and before he die, I throw water over him, and I say, labber is bad name, you now fish. And now I eat fish, sir." That's a nice little story, isn't it? Conveniently changing their names. Seems like a good place to stop for today. Well worth having a look at sloths if you're not really familiar with them. And even if you are, I bet again on YouTube and I bet on Google you'll be able to find all sorts of great images. You might even try searching on YouTube for David Attenborough and sloth and seeing what comes up. That'd be a good idea. In the meantime, thanks for joining me and hope to see you soon. Goodbye.